Assalamu alaikum, Juma Mubarak. Welcome to today's Friday Reflections on this Friday, the 1st of December 2023. We're in the last month of this year. So it's certainly a time for reflections. But at the beginning of December, for the past couple of years, we've been remembering our Sheikh Daoud Rosser-Owen, who sadly departed and when returned back to his creator on the 5th of December 2021. I miss him immensely. Sheikh Dawood was my sheikh and mentor for 10 years, become a dear friend. And he's someone who has had a profound influence upon me and been amazingly inspirational. And as I'm remembering Sheikh Dawood, I thought it would be nice to do something for Sheikh Dawood, for his legacy. So I printed off one of his articles, which he discussed with me. But he discussed even more than what's in this article. The history of Islam in the British Isles, an overview by Sheikh Daoud Rosser-Owen. And Sheikh Dawood discussed the history of Islam and the history of Islam in Britain, and also the history of Islam's connections with British people. So some people became Muslims, some people didn't become Muslims, but Islam has a long interaction with these islands and with the people who live here. And so I'm going to start reading from this. The History of the British Isles, an overview by Sheikh Daoud Rosser-Owen, copyright Daoud Rosser-Owen, 1998. It is known that there have been Muslims here in the British Isles on and off since the 7th century. By inference from what records survive, the present-day communities have, however, come here relatively recently and can be considered to have arrived in 4 phases. The 18th century, the final quarter of the 19th century, the 20th century from the beginning up to the end of World War II, and the period since 1955. From the earliest traces to the Middle Ages, there are persuasive traces that indicate that there has been a Muslim presence in parts of the British Isles since perhaps the 7th or 8th centuries AD. These historical straws in the wind come mainly from the western Celtic islands of West Scotland and the islands, Northern Ireland, Northwest and Southwest Wales, West Cornwall, Northern Brittany, and the Galicia province of Spain. Following military destructions of Celtic Christianity by agencies of the Church of Rome, almost all documentary records were destroyed. However, some traces of the evidence are to be found by inferences and also by the presence of anomalies in what records the church did allow to survive or was unable to suppress. It needs to be borne in mind that this was a period of great panic at the possible encirclement of the church by the rise and spread of Islam. The prospect of the British Isles, the vital ground in military terms of Western Europe, coming under the control of the Muslims, was not to be countenanced by the papacy or the Frankish and Visigothic kingdoms that did its bidding. Later, many of the surviving records were themselves destroyed or lost in various land grabs that went on in Scotland in the Middle Ages. By inference or reading between the lines, it seems that the Celts of the west of Britain were in direct seaborne contact with the Muslims as early as Amr ibn al-As conquered Egypt in 634 AD, and Jerusalem surrendered to the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab in 637 AD. These Celts traveled by sea direct to Egypt and the Levant for trade. This is a well-proved matter by, among others, Professors Emrys G. Bowen of the University College of Wales, Aberystwyth, and brought back with them all the news of the Orient. Among the evidences cited for this contact are the survival in Irish monasteries and nowhere else of obscure Gnostic Christian tracts, only otherwise known from the excavations at Nag Hammadi in Egypt. The fact that despite the official Church of Rome line, Celtic Christian monasticism owes almost nothing to Saint Martin and the Isle de Levant, and appears to come direct from the Egyptian Lauras, and that Celtic Christianity did not recognize the Bishop of Rome as having a comparable authority to the three patriarchs that it did recognize: Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. At this time, Celtic Christianity had not yet been subsumed into the Church of Rome, and would not be for another 200 years or so. Among what we know about Celtic Christianity, as opposed to the Celtic Church, which followed it, and which was Trinitarian, as probably also were the Utilise, Celidian, Irish, or I'm not going to try to read it because he's written the Utilise in Old Irish and Gaelic, or Socius Dien in Latin, or Companions of God, who were hunted down and exterminated by the sociopathic Queen Margaret, sister of the Saxon pretender to William the Conqueror's throne of England. Edward the Eighthling, and who was canonized by the Church of Rome for her energy against the Utilise and the remnants of the Celtic Church, was that it was Unitarian, believed in Christ as a person separate from and inferior to God. It's not clear how this was dealt with theologically. There are suggestions that he was considered a prophet, but this may have been later wishful thinking. Would not eat pig, slaughtered their meat, and kept the Jewish rituals and holidays. They were frequently accused by the Church of Rome of being Judaizers and Ebionites. The last great survival of Celtic Christianity was during the early decades of the 8th century in the kingdom of Dalriada, covering what is now Argyll in West Scotland, the southern inner Hebridean islands such as Islay, and Antrim in Northern Ireland up to the Bann Rivers. With the defeat of Dalriada by the Picts under Oengus mac Ferguson in the mid to late 8th century, and the imposition of the rule by the Church of Rome as a consequence, the records, priests, and many of the faithful of this religion migrated first to the non-Roman parts of Ireland, then to Wales. The last place in Wales was at Abbey Cumhir, and then to Dol in Brittany, then to Bretona, now Santiago de Compostela in Galicia, where the famous Celtic saint and heretic from Rome, Priscillian, is buried, and not the very unchristian sounding Asturian hero Saint James the Moor Slayer, Santiago Matamoros, Then they disappear into the Moorish conquest of northern Spain. So some interesting points here that Sheikh Daoud mentions is back as early as the 7th century CE. Now, the 7th century CE is when Islam started to develop in the Middle East. That there were contacts between the people, the Christians, and the people living in the west of these islands. So in Wales and Ireland and the west coast of these are the Celtic parts of the British Isles. There were contacts between these people and the Muslim caliphs going back as early as the 7th and 8th centuries. Another interesting thing that Sheikh Daoud brings out here, and also in conversations that I had with Sheikh Daoud, is that the original Celtic Christianity was monotheistic, not Trinitarian. Now, that's not to say that Trinitarians aren't monotheistic. I'm not going to get into that argument, but it was Unitarian rather than Trinitarian. So this means theologically, the original Celtic Christianity had much more in common with both Judaism and Islam than it did, and also the Christians led by Arius, than it did with the later Trinitarian Christianity, which came to dominate. And that is interesting. It's an interesting part of our history, which a lot of people are not aware of. There is a story that Sabak Mak Foter, High King of Dalriada, and my apologies to anyone who speaks Gaelic if I pronounced that completely wrong, of the House of Lorne in the early 700s, was a Muslim. And there were many Muslims in Dalriada, which is why Sabak gets a bad press in what little is written about him and why there was such a panic in Rome. The church paid for the southern picks of Fortran to take on at various times both Dalriada and the Welsh kingdom of Alclwyd, also known as Strathclyde. Wars, even in the 8th century AD, are expensive matters, and usually the side with the most money to hand wins. In fact, the name Salbachin in Old Irish, or I can't pronounce that in modern Scottish Gaelic, equating to the Latin Fortunatus, would be translated into Arabic as Ganur Mughni, elements in two common Muslim names. The Biatan clan, traditionally doctors and physicians up and down the islands and Western Highlands, is thought to have acquired its skills in Muslim Spain. After the defeat, and before the rise again less than a century later under Kenneth MacAlpine, the kingdom of the Scots and Picts, the records of Dalriada were systematically hunted out and destroyed on the orders of the Church of Rome. And only 3 documents survive. Actually, really only 2, as 2 of those are clearly rewrites of the same document. So it would seem that there were Muslim settlers here in the Western Celtic areas of the British Isles in the early centuries of Islam. Much research needs to be done on this just to discover the extent of the surviving documentary evidence, let alone fresh looks at archaeological material from Ireland, Wales, and the west of Scotland. From the Middle Ages to the Tudors. It is worth bearing in mind that Britain was always rather strange or oddball in its following of Christianity, and its adherence to the Church of Rome always left a lot to be desired by Rome. It was a continued stance, it was a continual source of heresies, such as the Pelagianism and its derivative variants, which was described by Dom Louis Gourgand, a French Jesuit historian, in Les Christianités Celtiques, editions Garbalda, Paris, 1911, my translation, as in some sense the national heresy of the Britons. Belief in Pelagianism would rather predispose a person to Protestantism or Islam. And even the Roman Church in Britain went its own way for the most part, much to the constant frustration of the papacy. Not content with ploughing their own furrow, the British would infuriatingly export their waywardness to the rest of Christendom. Pelagius himself, for example, taught his unwelcome views in Rome, Carthage, and Palestine during the early 5th century, together with his companion and acolyte Coelestinus, another Irishman or Scot. And Europe is dotted with towns such as St. Gallen in Switzerland and monasteries founded by Irish Peregrini monks like St. Columbanus. The real beginnings of Protestantism take place in England in the 14th century with the Oxford-educated Yorkshireman John Wycliffe's attacks on the Roman Catholic fundamentals, papal authority, confession, transubstantiation, and monasticism. He believed in the sole authority of the Holy Scripture and produced a partial translation of the Bible into English from the Latin Vulgate of St. Jerome. He was condemned by the Pope in 1377 and protected for a while by Oxford University, where he'd been master of Balliol College in 1360 and was currently warden of Canterbury Hall by his mentor, John of Gaunt, time-honoured Lancaster. He eventually went too far for his allies' comfort and was condemned by Oxford and by Archbishop Courtenay in 1381. He died in 1384 at Lutterworth. Another century or more, degenerating popular Protestantism during the later 15th century and into the 16th gave rise to the Hussites after Jan Hus in Bohemia, and through them led directly to the European Protestantism, which received such a boost from Martin Luther's publication of his theses. But it is because of Lollardy that much of England and Scotland was openly heretical and sympathetic to Calvinism when it arrived in the 16th century. So here, Sheikh Daoud is explaining the religious movements in Britain. Britain at that time, of course, was predominantly Christian. There may have been, as Sheikh Daoud mentioned, small numbers of Muslim settlers that had come here through their contacts, because Britain's an island, you know, people come and go on ships all the time. But Sheikh Daoud is going through the interesting developments in Christianity. He's saying that Britain wasn't a typically Christian country, at least by Catholic standards. And there are many movements in Britain before it became officially a Protestant country. And many of the questions that the Protestants are asking are also things which Muslims would ask about Roman Christianity. It is recorded that in the 12th or 13th century, that there was a factory, a local representative trading post of Arabs next to a wine warehouse in London. Not much more is known about it, because although some of the archives exist, not everything was destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666. The essential research hasn't been done. The Merchant Venturers Company dealt in the Baltic, sometimes in collaboration with the Hanseatic League, and sometimes in open competition with them. London, Berwick, and Leith had Hanseatic factories. In the Baltic, they traded with Turks in Lithuania and Muscovy for horses at the Novgorod Fair. The great ports on the east coast of Britain were London, Boston, Yarmouth, Hull, and possibly the richest town in England and Wales, sorry, England and Scotland, Berwick. Here, merchants from the Muslim world would arrive, stay, have dealings with the locals, and trade their wares. So factories such as in London were not unusual in any of the main ports or fair towns. I remember Sheikh Dawood telling me about this, how there was, because of this trading, there was actually a lot of Muslims at that time, and they would have little settlements in the port towns of Britain. So they wouldn't necessarily be inland, but where Britain had ports, where we're trading, you would have these people settle down, maybe not for too long, but maybe for 1, 2, or 3 years. They'd be trading, and then they'd travel back to where they came from. And it's an interesting development. And of course, some people also embraced Islam. Maybe small numbers, but it's an interesting history nonetheless, and it shows the connections are long-standing between Muslims and British society. The Middle Ages were noteworthy for the fairs, such as the great ones, Basel and Novgorod, where merchants from the Christian and Muslim worlds met and traded. The whole of Europe held lesser fairs. In England, among the most famous were St. Giles' Fair at Winchester, which lasted 3 weeks, St. Bartholomew's at Smithfield in London, near where the hospital used to be, St. Botolph's at Boston in Lincolnshire, St. Ives in Huntingdon, which lasted 8 days and had been granted by King John to the abbot and monks of Ramsey Abbey in 1202, and Stourbridge Fair in Cambridge. To these fairs came traders from the Muslim world, selling silks and cottons, the essential spices, condiments, herbal medicines, and manufacturers. It is thus quite possible that the medieval British man and woman had much more direct person-to-person contact with Muslims than many people do today. The existence of these 12th century and later bureaux allows us to draw certain inferences about the Muslims who manned them and how they would have behaved, because a lot is known about similar Muslim factories that were located in various places in Africa, around the coasts of southern India, most particularly in Southeast Asia, i.e. what is now called Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, and the Philippines, of course known as Temasek. Singapore was then little more than a mangrove swamp. The guilds, a noteworthy feature of the Middle Ages, were largely an invention of the Muslims, as were certain essential features of foreign trade, such as the promissory note or check, itself a loanword from the Arabic shak, a torn part, as the note would be torn and the parties would each keep one piece, which then married together would produce payment. And the factory, known variously as a zawaria or ribating in the west, a kankakur or durgahin in the east. In the Muslim world, the guilds or brotherhoods, Akaria, were part of the whole Tariqa movement, known to the present-day West as Sufism. These religious fraternities specialized in different activities, in which the members and adepts were required to participate as part of their spiritual practices. For example, tent making was the chosen area of the fraternity that the famous mathematician and poet Umar al-Khayyam, Umar the tent maker, belonged. Two great orders, one now known as the Shadali and still extant, and the other called the Sorawadi, now absorbed into the Naqshbandi, specialized in merchanting and foreign trade. The Shadaliya were active in the Levant, North and West Africa, and Spain, and so would have been dealing with Europe. And the Sorawadiya operated out of the Gulf, Multan and Uch, and South Arabia to the East African coast, South and Southeast Asia, and China. Next to the warehouse, or conveniently close, there would have been the hospice, Zawaria, Ribat, Kanka, or Durga, in which would have served them also as a community center and mosque. They would probably have belonged to the Sunni Maliki madhab, the jurisprudential school followed in Spain and most of North Africa, and they almost certainly have been members of the Shadli Sufi order. They would have had regular zikr meetings, colorful and musical affairs with much gaiety and food, the surplus of which would have been given to the local poor. Wa alaikum assalam. I'm reading about the history and connections of Islam with the British Isles. This is some of the work that my late Sheikh Daoud Rosser-Owen did, some of his research. Zikr meetings, the surplus of which and food, the surplus of which would have been given to the local poor, and they would have intermarried with the locals, usually with the daughters of important merchants, burgesses, nobles, and local officials. This is part of how Islam spread in the Malay lands. I'm good, alhamdulillah. How are you? In the early years of the 13th century, or the tail end of the 12th, King John I, the one who got the bad press about Robin Hood, sent word to the Sharif of Morocco that he wished to marry his daughter and was willing to convert to Islam to do so, which is why he's got such bad press since. He got excommunicated for his pains by the Church of Rome. Nothing more is known about the incident, as it has been hushed up. But again, many of the records still exist. It is further inferred that there were many Spanish Muslims wandering around Britain during this time. It is worth remembering that John's and Richard the Lionheart's mother was Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, and the granddaughter of the famous Duke William IX, acknowledged as the first of the troubadours, whose court was filled with scholars and so on from Muslim Spain, and for whom Islam was no stranger, and therefore no threat. Eleanor herself spoke and read Arabic. It's likely that the disappearance of these British groups of Muslims took place at the end of the 13th century and was simply catalogued amongst the purges of the Jews, such as took place in York in 1189 AD to mark the start of the Third Crusade. But some contacts and even intermarriages continued, partly through the institutions of crusading and pilgrimage. Yes, it's important to note that in the 12th century, around this time, like such as 1189 CE, there were pogroms against Jews in Britain. But maybe some of these pogroms were not just against Jews, but also against Muslims who were in Britain at that time. And it's just been recorded as pogroms against Jews, because bearing in mind, when the Muslims were in Spain, Muslims and Jews got on like this and worked together. People like Ibn Arabi and Maimonides were as much a scholar of all the Abrahamic traditions as Uh, Ibn Arabi was a scholar of Islam, and Maimonides was a great scholar of Judaism. These were great scholars within Islam and within Judaism, but equally they were very familiar with the other Abrahamic traditions. So there was a lot of mixing at that time between the Jews and the Muslims. So it wouldn't be surprising if these pogroms against the Jews in England, as they're recorded in our history books now, may have included a lot of Muslims as well. The House of Windsor, previously known as the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and therefore, before that as the House of Hanover, and before that as the House of Stuart, and before that as the House of Tudor, has a Sajara, 7 lines of descent, both Hassani and Husseini, from the Prophet Muhammad. There are many old families in Britain with similar Sajaras, and others who are descendants of the Spanish Umayyad caliphs also. These lines came about through intermarriage with Iberian families who descend from Moors, i.e. Arabs, such as the Portuguese Dukes of Lara. Apart from this, we are left largely with local tales and legends, which no self-respecting modern anthropologist would dismiss out of hand. The Moor, Azim, who appears in the Hollywood epic film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, although not in the usual tales of Robin Hood, does have some local legends to support his existence. In fact, there may have been more than one character during this Robin Hood thing, and some of these legends have become absorbed into that of Sir Robert de Locksley, Earl of Huntingdon. The whole episode of King Robert I, the Bruce, needs looking into, including the story of the spider in the cave, the murder of the Red Cummin, the coronation, the attempt to restore Celtic Christianity and the Celtic monarchy, the appearance of the Templar Knights at the decisive moment of the equally decisive Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the request to take his heart to the Holy Land, and its going to Spain, where it is cast in the midst of the Moorish army by Sir James Douglas in 1330, and indeed the constant involvement in Scottish politics, like a leitmotif of the Douglases, who, according to one account, contain within them the descendants of King Salbach Mac Ferrer, who was the Muslim Scot who was mentioned earlier. So much of the story and so many of the incidences and involvements have echoes of anecdotes from the Sufis of Spain and the West, something that might be connecting the two traditions. The surname Morris, which is common in Wales and the West Country, certainly derives from Moorish. Whether this also identifies a Moor, i.e. a Muslim, or simply an eponymous ancestor who looks like one is problematic. Whatever the answer may be, it is certain that Morris dancing comes from the Muslims of Spain and is derived from the Raksur Hadra of the Spanish Sufis. The questions remain largely unanswered as to what the Spanish Muslims were doing in Britain at that time, how they could mix so freely with the native population and be accepted by them, and how they could go about their business so easily without the church interfering, or rather, without the magistrates and justiciars taking any notice of what church officials said. Perhaps the answer is to be found in the timing and circumstances of King John's offer to the Sharif. The Tudor era. The Tudor period begins with the defeat of King Richard III, Crookback, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 by Henry Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, a putative descendant of Princess Joan, known as Tyrijogi Siren in Welsh history. I'm sorry, I can't read that as Welsh. The natural daughter of King John I, who was quite legitimate by the laws of Huda, who married Llywelyn ap Iwydd, the Prince of Gwynedd. John of Gaunt, protector of John Wycliffe, and of Queen Catherine de Valois, the Kate of Shakespeare's play King Henry V, who was his grandmother. The Earl became King Henry VII and was eventually succeeded in his brilliant second son, who became King Henry VIII. This Henry's older sister, Princess Margaret, married King James IV of Scotland in 1503. 100 years later, in 1603, her great-grandson became, in effect, the first king of the British Isles, when he succeeded his cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, to the throne of England as King James VI of Scotland and the First of England, and ushered in the rule of the House of Stuart, which at present, well, he wrote this in 1998, which Queen Elizabeth II, our late Queen, continued, and now obviously King Charles I. King Charles I? King Charles III, sorry. When the Tudor monarch, King Henry VIII, broke up with Rome, England was already to a great extent popularly a Protestant country, and Scotland was well advanced on the same path, with John Knox teaching Calvinism. The break with Rome was brought about by stupid European power politics directed at the British Isles, and was born out of a fear that a link-up between the British and the Muslims was possible. The Spaniards had become obsessive about the Muslims because of their long crusade against the Moors of Spain, which had entered an intense, if not frenetic phase, with the fall of Granada. There seemed to be Muslims hiding everywhere, even disguised as Christians and nobles of Old Castile. By the mid-1500s, the neurotic obsession with the purity of the blood was in full swing. So was the burning of Muslims, Jews, heretics, and apostates. Yeah, sadly, in our history, a lot of people were burned, especially in Spain, but not only in Spain. They were literally burned alive. They were tied to a pole, a fire was put underneath them, and they were burned for simply having the wrong religious beliefs, or what went against the church, what they said was the wrong religious beliefs. I mean, it's really awful when you think about it, that people could be treated in that way. But it's real. This is real history in Europe. And only, what, 500 years ago? The Spanish economy was in severe downturn over the country as a whole. Parts of it, such as Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia, and the Balearics, were in total financial collapse. This was owing to the expulsion of the Moors and the persecution, pogroms is not too strong a word, of the Moriscos, Moranos, even the Christian Mozarabs from the Arabic Mustarib, an Arabified person. Because also in Spain, as well as the people who became Muslims, there were also a large numbers of Christians who spoke Arabic and were influenced by what we would understand to be Arabic Muslim culture, even though they were Christians. And they loved Arabic poetry. They wrote in Arabic poetry. They used Arabic frequently. And the conversos by the Church of Rome's Holy Office, more commonly known as the Spanish Inquisition, and their mass extermination by burning at the stake the regular autos de fe, excavated matters. Many Jews and Muslims fled to North Africa. Many others joined the guerrillas in Sierra Morena, the Sierra Nevada, and Alporajas. The pitiful story of the hounding and persecution of the Moriscos continued from the fall of Granada in the last decade of the 15th century until the last of them was finally deported from Murcia to North Africa in the early months of 1614. All this was quite well known in the British Isles. Sorry. All this was quite well known in the British Isles. And I'll find my page in a minute. Yeah, here it is. So carry on from there. All this was quite well known in the British Isles, and with the weakening of the control of the Church of Rome, never really very strong, there was a danger in the eyes of the papacy that England might tie up with the Moroccans. This seems to have been a constant nightmare from the 8th century onwards, that there might be a collaboration between the British and Muslims of Spain and North Africa. This has become complicated over the centuries by the Church coming to believe its own propaganda, and that there was no difference between the heresies of Protestantism and the infidelities of Judaism and Islam. A Muslim was as bad as a Protestant. It seems that the Church sometimes was unaware that there was any differences between them. So that it may be that at key periods, the papacy actually thought that Islam was just another Christian heresy. And so Britain's Protestants were, to all intents and purposes, Muslims. Perhaps it was also thought that the Moriscos were taking refuge in the British Isles. And there may have been. We don't know, because the research hasn't been done. Papal policy was to get a dynastic marriage with a solid European crown to get Britain into the heart of Europe by a coup de main, subterfuge. The eldest son of King Henry VII, Prince Arthur, was duly married in 1502 to the King of Spain's daughter. But not only did King Henry die, but also, inconveniently, did his son, of consummation 5 months after his wedding. The teaching of the church was that it was forbidden by that same church, for a man to marry his dead brother's widow. The convoluted thinking was that as a husband and wife had become one flesh, with the consummation of the marriage, therefore the wife had become the sister of her husband's brothers and the daughter of her father-in-law. And for a sister to marry her brother was therefore considered incest. Because they regarded the wife of the dead brother as the sister of his brother, if you get my gist. So they saw that as the same as incest. Therefore, for a man to marry his dead brother's widow was also incest. This was, of course, in flagrant disregard of the Old Testament injunctions to the Levirate, and was probably therefore uncanonical, and also flew in the teeth of common sense. But politics is politics, and the nightmare had always demanded extreme measures. So when King Henry VIII was eventually successfully married to Princess Catherine of Aragon, the Infanta de Castilla of the Elephant and Castle. Yes, there's a place in London that's actually called Elephant and Castle. In 1509, it seemed that the nightmare was over. Then, when she failed to give him a son and heir, Henry, quite a devout man for his day and age and country, came to believe that he was cursed by God for his so-called incest. So he asked the Pope for an annulment, expecting that it would be granted. Henry was very learned in theology, but the Pope was in the pocket of the King of Spain. So when the annulment was refused for political reasons, the same Pope had actually annulled the marriage of a German king in similar circumstances only a couple of years before. And so when Henry realized that this was just political, he was outraged at this blatant abuse of religion by the Pope for mere politics and considering it blasphemous. And so followed the train of events that led to the break from Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. With an interval when Queen Mary Tudor who was married to King Philip II of Spain, tried to restore the Church of Rome in England. And Mary of Guise was regent in Scotland, and her daughter, Mary Stuart, was in France being educated and eventually married to the Dauphin. And the Catholics enjoyed a period of ascendancy there too. England was effectively at war with Spain, or France, or both, and the papacy. And finally, when Queen Elizabeth I ruled England, Wales, and Ireland, came the threat of invasion by the Duke of Parma's army from the Spanish Netherlands, and the Great Armada set sail in 1588 under Medina Sidonia to aid in moving Parma to Kent. But it was not to be. The Spanish fleet was harried by the English all the way up the English Channel. It was attacked with fire ships as it lay off the Low Countries, so that's by Holland, and had to disperse to save itself. A storm blew up and dispersed elements that were scattered all over the North Sea, many perishing in the hazardous waters or being wrecked on the Dogger Bank. The scattered remnants tried to run before the storm around the north of Scotland and back around Ireland to Spain, many being driven ashore by weather in the Atlantic. It is known that many Moriscos and Conversos were among the shipwrecked around the coasts of North and West Scotland, the islands, and the west of Ireland. There are many stories from those parts of the British Isles of such people marrying local women and returning to their heathen ways. The Irish surname Mahood is said to derive from this period. In 1587, Queen Elizabeth I of England, Ireland, and France had arranged an agreement with the Ottoman Empire that if the Spanish landed in England, the Ottomans would come to the rescue. The prospect of aid from regiments of Janissary Marines did not seem an unwelcome thing. The Church of Rome, with its Inquisition, was deeply feared in England, especially as the persecutions and martyrdoms of Queen Mary's reign were still fresh memories, and in Scotland after the activities of the French Guise family, and the Muslims were not. And what was going on in Spain was not unknown either. It was well known also that in Europe, if Protestants could escape into the Ottoman domains, such as southern Silesia, Hungary, or Bosnia, they were safe from Romish persecution. Help from such quarter was therefore not a problem. Corsairs, Mamluks, travelers, adventurers, and servants of empire. In the period from the 14th to the early 19th centuries, many of the Barbary corsairs and Sully rovers from Salé in Morocco, now absorbed into Casablanca, came from Britain. These corsair fleets were based in certain ports along the North African coast. The sailors of these fleets were Mamluks and Muslim converts, having first been taken as slaves in raids and naval encounters. The fleets of a number of these ports had affiliations across the Mediterranean in Europe. Algiers, for example, was for years the 18th century a largely French manned fleet and always served French interests. And Tripoli, in what is now Libya, was British. They would even act as proxies for their original countries when certain deniability was needed, such as keeping the Americans out of the Mediterranean after 1785, when Britain and France fought their wars. The Tripoli fleet provided intelligence for Nelson's squadron prior to the Battle of the Nile, and its ships frequently victualled and took shelter with Royal Navy vessels in Majorca and Gibraltar. The Tripoli fleet would organize regular furloughs back to Britain for the sailors to see their families. There are many West Country rumors about such Muslim families. Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel was well-known corsair staging place, and there was a base for many years on the Isle of Wight. There is no reason to suppose that there weren't other such bases at convenient locations around the coasts of Southern Ireland, South Wales, Cornwall, and the southwest of England. There are other little points. The admiral of the Tripolitanian Corsair fleet during Nelson's Battle of the Nile, and also the person responsible for capturing and beaching the USS Philadelphia, leading to Stephen Decatur's moment of fame and the phrase in the US Marine Corps hymn To the Shores of Tripoli, was that demonic Scot called Murad Reis, previously Peter Lyle, master mariner sailing out of Leith as the first mate on a ship trading into the Mediterranean, and in conversation with his friend Colonel Worthington, the British consul in Tripoli, whom he shared a passion for growing roses. Admiral Murad stated that British corsairs, who mostly seem to have come from the West Country, South Wales and Southern Ireland, used to go home on the regular furlough to visit their families in Britain. The age of the corsairs died with the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. Another Scot who was killed commanding the rear guard and who had been the military governor of Medina during the Ottoman War against the Wahhabis the same year that Napoleon was beaten at Waterloo, was Thomas Keith, Ibrahim Aga of Edinburgh, who had been an armourer in the 78th Highlanders when he was captured during the expedition to Al Mansura in Egypt in 1807. He had been one of the last of the Mamluks. The famous British Orientalist of Swiss origin, John Lewis Burckhardt, was a Muslim who settled in Cairo, performed the pilgrimage in 1813, and died and was buried in Cairo in 1815. General Wheeler, one of the heroes of Cornpuri, where he was killed during the Indian Mutiny of 1857, was a Muslim. In fact, unlike what commonly happens in the UK in the period after World War II, for a British officer to become a Muslim during the Raj in India was not viewed as a career disadvantage and treated with suspicion and ostracism. Many of the political officers operating in the frontier and inside Afghanistan were converted Muslims. Among the last examples of this are the cases of Shepherd and Green, two Britons serving in Malaya and Borneo during the period immediately after World War II. Haji Mubin Shepherd became a famous personage in Kuala Lumpur, where he would entertain his guests to tea on the terrace of the Spotted Dog, the Selangor Cricket Club. And Haji Muhammad Ali Green settled on the island of Libawan in the estuary of the Brunei River. The really relatively well-documented period of settlers from the Muslim world comes at the end of the 19th century. These were, for the most part, sailors, lascars of the merchant ships that would dock in the ports of Cardiff, Tiger Bay, in Swansea, Bristol, London, South Shields, Leith, Glasgow, and Liverpool. The sailors married local women and settled. Mostly the sailors were from three areas: the Malay Islands, Bengal, and the area of Yemen, Aden, and Somalia. The Muslim community in the East End of London dates back to the days of the Indiamen of the Honourable East India Company. This places its origins in the 18th century. The best documented of the 19th century communities are two, Cardiff and Liverpool. The Cardiff community dates from the 1870s or 1880s and was made up mostly of Yemenis who married local Welsh girls. They had a mosque in Tiger Bay, which was an old chapel, and the exterior of which had been rendered and whitewashed to look like a South Arabian mosque. They followed the Sunni Shafi'ite madhab and the Shadli Sufi order, the Alawiyah branch. They have since been moved out of what used to be the Tiger Bay and resettled. They have a new mosque, which is not so picturesque. The Liverpool community is particularly interesting because it attracted a number of British Muslim converts led by a solicitor of Manx origin, Abdullah William Quilliam, as a solicitor who was the founder of the Association of British Muslims. As a solicitor to the City Corporation of Bradford in West Riding of Yorkshire, he was asked to participate in the opening of a new city hall. He did so by reciting the opening chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha. He became a Muslim in Morocco, studied at the famous Qawarine University at Fez, and was graduated as an alim from there and recognized as such. He wrote many pamphlets on Islam, which are available in British Library, London, for research. He set up an organization which eventually came to be called the English Islamic Association. They had many meetings and organized a mosque community center, which had a meeting hall and library, and a madrasa, a religious school. It seems that there are two separate communities, or perhaps one should say two distinct communities, because they work together, the English converts and the settlers. It doesn't seem that they intermarried much at that stage, which implies that whole families of English people had converted to Islam. They attracted a lot of hostility from the establishment. A reading of the letters pages of the Times at the time of the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 and the Balkan War of 1912 gives a flavor of what they had to put up with. Finally, at the eve of World War I, most of them fled to the Ottoman Empire for refuge. Quilliam's oldest son was a major in the Ertugrul Life Guard Regiment, for example. It is, however, important institutionally that Quilliam was appointed Shaykh al-Islam of the British Isles by the Caliph, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, Janatul Makkah. And this was endorsed by the Qajar Shah of Persia for the Shia on the advice from the Ayatollahs in Qum. The King of Afghanistan, the Emir of Morocco, with the wholehearted approval of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The Queen Empress was very proud that she ruled over many more Muslims than Sultan Abdulhamid and was always discharged this duty on his behalf as Caliph. Her descendants were proud to continue this tradition. This means that the office of Shaykh al-Islam has been legitimately established in the UK by the age-old method and can be revived at any time when the Muslims can get their act together. And by the doctrine of residual sovereignty, this legitimacy devolves on the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, the dependent territories of the Channel Islands and the Isle of Man also. Any or each of these could appoint their own Shaykh al-Islam with the proper caliphal authority. The mosque still exists in Liverpool. It is part of a local government buildings complex and used to store archives. Actually, it is now a mosque again. It was bought back by the Muslim community and restored as a mosque. The other communities that were established about the same time as Liverpool and Cardiff ones seem to have disappeared. There were also, from the latter decades of the 19th century, various refugees from the Muslim world living here. This increased after the Young Turk Revolution in the Ottoman Empire in 1908, when many Ottoman families sought exile here rather than live under their godless, anti-religious rule. Many of these are buried in Brookwood Cemetery near Woking. One interesting angle is the activity of certain converts around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Prominent amongst these were the diplomat Henry Lord Stanley of Alderley, Al-Farouk Lord Headley, on whose land the Shah Jahan Mosque in Woking was built in pure Mughal style, and Muhammad Marmaduke Pictou, sometime resident minister in Hyderabad, Deccan, who translated the Quran. The era after 1914, most of the present-day settlers in the UK arrived, of course, after the 1960s. Initially, these were mostly from the Indian subcontinent, but in recent years, there have been arrivals from all over the Muslim world. There are even ethnic Chinese and Japanese Muslims here. Now, the majority of the Muslim population of the British Isles comes from elsewhere than the Indian subcontinent, who now account for less than 48% of the total. Many of, I mean, bearing in mind, these figures are from 1998. Many of these are from East Africa, particularly Eritreans, Somalis, and Sudanese, and from the Maghreb, especially Morocco. There is, however, a very large community of converts, both white and Afro-Caribbean origins. These two singly offensive descriptions are used because they appear on an increasing number of official forms and questionnaires. Yeah, so African, Caribbean, and white converts are quite common in the UK. Estimates place the total number of converts in the religion back in 1998 to between 50,000 to 80,000. It's obviously a lot more now. Some chose to be known as reverts on the basis of the Quranic injunction that states every child is born a Muslim. It's parents who make them a Christian, Jew, or Magian. So this was what I've been reading for those who join me later. This is the history of Islam in the British Isles, an overview by the Shaykh, late Daoud Rosser-Owen, who was for many years the Emir of the Association of British Muslims. And for 10 years, my mentor and one of my sheikhs. I hope you found that interesting and fascinating. I must admit, when Sheikh Daoud first started to share bits of this information with me, was it now about 13, 14 years ago? I mean, it really amazed me at the time. You know, it was quite new to me, some of this information, and it's not widely known. But Sheikh Daoud was a man who did his research. So, and I've got books as well since, which I've seen some of this information that's being researched by other people. Some developed a bit further. Others make mention of it, and it's this. This is important information. It should be more out there. People should be more aware. It would solve a lot of problems if people were. We have an interesting history, and Islam has been here since pretty much the outset, from the 7th to 8th centuries. Even if it was smaller numbers, still Islam has touched these islands. It's had an impact on not only Muslims living in the United Kingdom, but also on the history and development of the United Kingdom. It's had an impact on the development of Protestant Christianity. It's had an impact upon our culture in numerous different ways. And a lot of people are unaware of this. Some people in predominantly Muslim countries even refer back to a British culture or cultures derived from Britain, such as American culture and Australian culture, as being kafir, not realizing that large aspects of our culture and of even the faiths that other people practice has influences from Islam. I mean, he mentions in here, Sheikh Dawood mentioned about the guilds which were founded or established, it come out of Islam because Muslims already had these guilds. We didn't have them before the interaction with Muslims. And these guilds become really important in making a number of different institutions, a number of different trades, is what I'm looking for, trades, more professional, upskilling people. In many ways, they were the forerunners to what became colleges that teach skills that are like like what you call them, vocational skills that we have now. They were really important institutions in their day, and led the way for the development of other forms of education and standards, which is where we get a lot of our professional standards from. But the foundations of this come from those interactions with Muslim tradesmen. So it's fascinating, it's interesting, and really people should know more about this. But the reason I read this today is, it's been 2 years since Sheikh Dawood returned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I just wanted to read something from Sheikh Dawood to honor his memory and his legacy, because I'm missing him, to be honest. I hope you found it useful. And thank you for joining us for this Friday Reflections. It's now Saturday early morning here in the UK, and I'm going to leave you now. But may Allah bless you all, and wherever you're in the world. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I wish you all have a wonderful weekend.